Kung may local and national issues, siyempre may international man. Nagabaga sa gyapon nga issue ang epekto sa ekonomiya sa Amerika sa mga stock market sa palibot sang kalibutan. Kag balita man ang riots didto sa United Kingdom partner. Kag sa sinema treon na may makaistorya kita live via Skype nga profesor didto sa mga United Kingdom. Fellow ini mga kapuso sang Sociology sa Department of Political Science, International Studies sang School of Government and Society sa Birmingham University, si Dr. Dan Whisker. Dr. Whisker, we understand, we understand it's about midnight there already in Birmingham, but we'd like to greet you good morning here in the Philippines from Iloilo City, and it's really a pleasure to have you here now.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me, Mark and Charlie.
Yeah, thank you too, sir.
Yes, Dan, how are you doing there now? Has the violence reached your place already?
No, it seems to have quietened down here in Birmingham. It's raining this evening, and that certainly discourages people from going out onto the streets. And I think the police were far more prepared this evening than they were yesterday and the day before. So I think the peak of the event seems to have passed.
All right. Sir Dan, please tell us how far and wide has the riots reached?
Well, the situation is very fluid, and this is one of the confusing things about these riots, that there is no centre. Certainly last night, London itself was quieter, but violence seemed to spread to most of the major cities in Britain, and also to some of the smaller towns, the market towns in the English regions.
Based on what we have seen and read, the violence was brought about by a shooting incident and the protest about it that followed. Can you tell us how exactly did this come about? Was that shooting incident the sole reason, or it was just a trigger?
Well, Mark, I'm afraid the details of the shooting itself are rather unclear at the moment.
Okay.
At first, there were reports that the young man involved had fired at the police, but now that seems not to have been the case. And the trigger for the riot itself, for the initial riot, was a demonstration outside Tottenham Police Station, consisting of about 200 people. And it seems that the police lined up outside the station and at some point restrained or tried to force back a young woman who was asking them questions, and the crowd became angry, and the initial riot started from there, although of course it spread far beyond that area since then.
And we also heard that the rioters are mostly young people. What is behind this wave of violence coming from the youth sector?
Well, in a sense, this is the most complex issue at stake, and it's difficult to pinpoint a single cause. If you think back a few months ago to what happened in Vancouver, in Canada, the local sports team there lost a big match, and there were riots immediately afterward. Now, of course, while losing an ice hockey match might have been a trigger for those events, it can't be described as a cause. So the question of what makes apparently thousands of people feel the need to copy an isolated instance of violence is a very problematic one. Certainly, there are serious structural inequalities which make these young people feel they have to lose. Unemployment is far higher amongst unqualified young men than among other sectors of the population. And there are areas of the cities, importantly, where the shadow economy of drug dealing is far more vibrant than the legitimate economy, where you can make more money selling drugs than you could ever hope to get from working in one of the menial jobs available. And as a consequence, a parallel society develops outside the law. So, in a sense, these events are closer to the kind of endemic problem that we see in Colombia, for example, where the state, in a sense, loses legitimacy than they are with the protests in Egypt.
Okay. So news reports say social media and mobile phones have been used by the rioters. How has this contributed to the violence? Has it worsened the problem?
Well, as I said earlier, what's made these events rather difficult for the police to deal with is the flexibility or the mobility of the riots, the fact that they're unpredictable. So rather than an organized demonstration marching on a particular seat of power, for example, the City Hall, and making a particular set of demands, the violence has seemed in the initial stages to be almost random, and undoubtedly social media have contributed to this, helping rioters to avoid the police by letting their fellows know where the police are stronger or weaker, and by arranging new locations. So, as with the Vancouver sports riot, you can say that while social media aren't a cause of rioting, since almost everybody has a mobile phone now, they've had an effect on the shape of the disorder, the way that people move around the city.
Okay, Dan, we're just very curious here in the Philippines why most of the rioters are youth.
Well, as with suicide bombers, or the kamikaze, or any other kind of inexplicable behavior which looks insane or meaningless to outsiders, in fact, it's important to understand these riots in a social context. So, for a youth to feel that, if indeed it is a youth that's rioting, several rioters seem to have been older people, employed people, pursuing these kinds of events mainly for fun, for excitement and pleasure. But for a young man to feel that he has more to lose by refusing to participate in a riot than by gaining a criminal record speaks about the social context in which someone lives. If it's more dangerous or more worrying for you to acquire a reputation in your neighborhood for disloyalty or for cowardice, and if you never expect to find a job anyway, then gaining a criminal record loses some of its deterrent power. So we might think that peer pressure loses its force at the school gates. Isn't the case.
Okay.
So what lessons can be learned from this incident, Mr. Dan? It's a little bit surprising because, you know, London, it's a peaceful place.
Yeah. And why is it that the police were just overpowered by these rioters?
Well, I think the police, along with the politicians and probably the rioters themselves, were surprised at just how quickly the events transpired, how many copycat incidents there were across London initially and then across other parts of the city. And I think it speaks to, in a sense, a deep and often neglected social fracture in British society, which is that significant numbers of people feel that the traditional means of expressing political dissent, which are certainly well established within British cities. There's a great tradition of peaceful and even of violent dissent. For people to feel as though those traditional avenues have no efficacy, are ineffective for them. And so instead, where people feel that they have no means of expressing their frustration or no way to understand themselves what that frustration consists of, then rather than a progressive political kind of protest, as we saw in Egypt, we see instead this kind of inarticulate rage, a seeking for status at a very microscopic level.
Okay.
So how is your government addressing this problem now, sir?
Well, it seems that the government, which at the moment is Conservative, is very much focusing on a strong law and order response. They're talking about plastic bullets, about riot control, about water cannons, about increased numbers of police on the streets, which over the course of the next 3 or 4 days might well reduce the incidences of violence, but which I don't think are likely to address long-term structural problems around the shadow economy, around political disenfranchisement, around the relationship between the state and people, which I think, of course, are far more complicated problems in a sense. flooding the streets with police.
Okay.
Okay. By the way, Mr. Dan, may we know where you are right now? Your exact location?
I'm in King's Heath in Birmingham, which is about 3 miles south of the city centre.
Okay, so it's basically quiet and safe there.
Yes, there have been
Alright.
1 or 2 reports of groups of youths in the centre of King's Heath, which is a small shopping area, about half a mile last night. But I think most problems are concentrated in the city centre. As you may know, 3 men were killed last night by a hit-and-run driver. The 3 men were from the South Asian community, and I think reports indicate that the driver was Afro-Caribbean, was black, and so there have been some concerns that this might give the riots a racial dimension, that different ethnic communities within the city might start to fight one another. But Birmingham's generally been very good about this, and hopefully that won't be the case.
All right,
Okay.
Dr. Dan Whisker of Birmingham University, thanks much indeed for the time. Have a good sleep, sir.
Good night.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Charlene. You have a good morning.
Thank you.
Bye. O, ikaw lang tayo kilala, yung partner no?
And Mark, ginahambal niya yung pangalan. Gusto ko pa tani ipalagas kung na-surprise
Hindi.
siya bala sa sini nga mga insidente sa ila lugar ha, sa
Actually,
London.
partner, malayo
Or
sila
na-alarma
dali.
siya.
Malayo sila
Malayo
dali.
siya mga 30 kilometers daw.
Gani.